Anyway, let us begin on my left with Saulius.
Thank you, Mr. Bulgarsky, for such a nice introduction. I think that in some sense I have to be a little bit of a wet blanket on this political discussion, because I'm actually more interested in the historical aspects of this question of World War II and conflicting perspectives. But let's take it off the top here. If we look at September 1st, 1939, which for many people in the West, certainly for Poland, is the beginning of World War II, then we'll see that the infamous Dachau complex, along with many other camps of the Reich, housed tens of thousands of inmates. The Gulag, on the other hand, had by then engulfed millions. Hitler had murdered scores of his political opponents, but this paled before the massive bloodletting of Stalin's great purges in terms of numbers. Millions had already perished in the state-induced famine in Ukraine. In sum, Stalinism's body count of the decade which preceded the opening salvos of the Second World War exceeded that of Nazism more than 100-fold. In 1940, the USSR became the first belligerent to carry out a systematic murder of Allied POWs, who were, it should be recalled, wore the uniforms of a member of the Anti-Fascist Alliance. This atrocity was accompanied by massive Soviet repression directed against the civilians of Eastern Poland. Perhaps the more perceptive would guess at the horrors yet to come. Ponary, Babi Yar, gas chambers, Auschwitz, Treblinka. But at least in 1940, and perhaps as late as June 21st of 1941, you didn't have to be much of a fascist sympathizer to conclude which of the two regimes was worse. All you had to do was be able to count numbers. Now, of course, if I presented such a narrow slice of history to be taken seriously, as a sort of a general proposition, it would be certainly even offensive. It would be offensive to the millions of victims of National Socialism. And that is because, of course, on June 22nd, 1941, the world changed forever, in a way which we all are aware of. And Central and Eastern Europe became the slaughterhouse unparalleled, I would argue, not even for the 20th century, but for all of human history. And certainly, Nazism very quickly equaled and surpassed Stalinism's mass murder count in terms of comparing Nazism and communism. Now, when we look at historical issues, there are several things we have to consider. Why is it then so difficult to talk about this topic, particularly under commemorative circumstances such as May 9th? Let us, however, remember one thing in particular when talking about history and comparing it to memory. History is not meant the same thing. Commemorative occasions, as you gather, are occasions in which group loyalty is reinforced. It is at heart, in the broadest sense, a political act. It is not historical analysis. In fact, commemorations tend to be hostile towards any form of historical analysis, which tends to recognize shades of gray and various difficulties and complexities. Now, we know, for example, that we have a great deal of conflicting narratives concerning World War II. Let me mention just a few detailed items. First of all, the very language in which the war is described, I will just mention two examples, is very different from the perspectives of, let's say, Baltic citizens, Lithuanians, Latvians, or Estonians, and, for example, those people who fought on the Soviet side in World War II, or were, in fact, as Jews, liberated by the Soviet side in World War II. Two examples. One is, of course, the term anti-fascist, which carries a positive and wonderful connotation for most people, West and East. But I have to tell you that for my parents' generation, the only anti-fascists they ever met were Stalinists. And so, therefore, that word never carried any positive connotation. This isn't simply a matter of language differences. It is a difference of the experience of the people themselves. The second example concerns the fact of understanding the very chronology of the war. In the West, 1939 is the beginning, and May 9th or 8th, depending on which you choose to pick, is the end. But I've done the research. In my father's village, in that area, in that district, there were very few Jews. And in fact, more people died violently after May 9/45 than before, up till about 1950. And this is true, I'm sure. If I did the research in parts of West Ukraine elsewhere, it would be true of other parts of Eastern Europe. And so therefore, people's memories, their historical narratives that they teach themselves, is different not only because we use words differently. In fact, in Lithuanian, there's a word, pokaris, which means after war. It's a kind of a phrase used commonly. And the word after war is a word of violence. It commemorates the fact that more ethnic Lithuanians were slaughtered after 1945 than during the Second World War. Now, the other thing that has to be considered from different perspectives, in other words, I'm not a great optimist that we can ever share a history together. We all share a past, yes. The events are the events. If the tree falls and there's no one to hear it, it still falls. But history is about narratives, and these narratives have to be different based on people's historical perspectives and also scholarly analysis. I think the other thing, why this issue is so difficult, is because it brings to the fore the obvious moral ethical issues. Millions of people were murdered by both regimes. Some in the 1930s, some in the 1940s. How this is remembered and how this is analyzed brings to the core these moral ethical issues. And one of the factors I would like for us to remember is some people behave as if on June 22nd, 1941, the Kremlin suddenly ceased being a criminal regime by some magic wand. And that it became again a criminal regime on May 9th, 1945. And the intervening period, somehow, the admittedly enormous contribution of Soviet citizenry and its armed forces in the defeat of fascism and Nazism, not to speak of the liberation of the concentration camps of Eastern Europe, somehow is, Catholics will understand this, somehow is redemption from the other massive crimes. I don't particularly buy this perspective. I don't think it is very helpful, but I can understand why it would have such force in terms of trying to remember the Second World War. Now finally, we also have to speak about the comparative history and its approaches in several very specific ways. There are two issues, I think, which have come up, and here perhaps there's a relationship to the current political discussion that is going on, sometimes very intensely, in the Baltic capitals, in Moscow and St. Petersburg and all over Eastern Europe about the meaning of World War II, and also the efforts by the Russian government, particularly through this Medvedev Commission dominated by the security services, to impose a narrative to actually criminalize alternate narratives of World War II in a very, I think, particularly nasty way. And so we're faced with this question of comparative history. I think two aspects of it, one specific and one general. First of all, the real story of 1939 to 1941, when the Soviet Union was not exactly an ally of Nazi Germany. There was no formal treaty of alliance, but there was a tactical arrangement directed against the West, while Britain fought all alone at that point against the fascist peace. And I think that the interpretation of this period has to be looked at quite closely by future historians, and it is being done now. That is one issue I think that we have to talk about and we have to consider closely. Actually, we know from German records that Nazi Germany, between the period of the signing of the Ribbentrop Pact and also the summer of 1941, their own records indicate that they considered Soviet economic assistance to be of maybe not critical, but of extremely important aspect of their general war plans directed against the West. A little aside to this that might interest you is that in the spring of 1940, as the Soviet government was preparing the occupation of the Baltic states, one of the accusations they leveled against Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia was that they were too pro-British. This is often forgotten in the way the narrative of the war is remembered later. The other, I think, and I'll end with this because I don't want to hog the time, and I know that in these kinds of situations it's easy to talk past one's allotted time period, is the whole issue that has been brought up recently, particularly in Eastern Europe, the question of the comparative merits or comparative crimes, rather, of communism and Nazism in general. And here I think this particular issue became very political last summer when I was in Vilnius, and the parliamentary session of the OCSC was being held there, and it actually broke out into the open in a very angry debate, which caused in Parliament Mr. Valiūnas to walk out and protest, with accusations that the comparison of communism and Nazism simply cannot be allowed, and the insistence by Lithuania, supported by Poles and other East Europeans, that such a comparison. I think there is a difference between equating two systems and the very legit scholarly activity of comparative history, which is quite another thing. Here I conclude with a thought, I think, that when we compare these two systems, we have to be clear about what we are comparing exactly. When we talk about the Stalinist regime and its mass murder period, which I would begin with the late 1920s, early 1930s, and continuing onward, and we compare that with the Nazi genocide, particularly of the Jews, Roma, and of course massive killings of Polish citizens, for example, millions of people, that I would put forth is that I do not think that we can characterize Soviet mass murder as genocide. I think that genocide, in a scholarly sense, the definition of it does not apply. On the other hand, from an ethical or moral perspective, I fail to see any difference whatever between the mass murder of millions and the genocide of millions as a human proposition of actually killing people who are innocent and defenseless. So here we have several issues. Some deal with scholarship, others deal with the ethical implications of that. I had a long paper that I had put together, particularly on the publication elsewhere, but this would be too long to read, and after all, it wouldn't be, I think, relevant to this point, but I would like to read the last paragraph, if I may. And this is simply my point of view, not shared by, I'm sure, many others. It is unfortunate that the great patriotic war narrative is now too often invoked as a kind of fig leaf to deflect discussion from the huge costs inflicted by the Soviet regime on its own people. The Kremlin was the seat of a criminal regime. This reality did not magically vanish on June 22, 1941, nor did it suddenly resume after a hiatus on May 1945. The heroism and sacrifice of the Soviet people in defeating Nazism is trivialized and diminished when it is employed as a political weapon to legitimize the Stalin system, to serve Russian geopolitical interests, or to draw discussion of the crimes of a failed philosophy. This is a sensitive and difficult issue for many non-Jewish East Europeans. It is maddening and counterintuitive in the complex emotions it engenders. It is difficult to appreciate for those outside the experience. In the hindsight of over a half-century, people who argue that Soviet victory was preferable to Nazi conquest are probably right. Respect is due to the dead and the heroes. Yet the current inhabitants of this historically most devastated region of the world have the right to plead. Please spare us any more stories of red liberation, save us from compulsory expressions of the effusive gratitude. In hindsight, the aging victims of Stalinism and their heirs may have to grudgingly accept rescue from famine and suffering under the future. But it's not something they should be asked to celebrate. Thank you for your attention.